All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend David Dayen. David is an independent journalist whose work you can find at davedayen.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at @ddayen. David, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
All right, so David, you recently wrote a frankly frightening piece at Salon, which again, you're good at frightening people, but we should be frightened here, my friend. But you actually wrote a piece at Salon recently on how the next financial crisis appears to be looming. Why don't you just tell us all about it?
Right. I mean, maybe, for the purposes of lessening your fear to some degree, we don't totally know when the next financial crisis is going to happen. I can't pinpoint it. I can't give you a date. What we do know is that the conditions that basically created the last crisis are still prevalent. Dodd-Frank did not go far enough to prevent the kind of operations that we saw during the crisis. Now, it's not going to happen in the exact same place. It might not happen around subprime mortgages, but it's certainly the case that over the last couple years, risk has pooled in certain areas of the financial system. What we know is that there are these things called leveraged loans, which are almost junk bonds, very risky bond instruments that are put out by various corporations, ways in which they receive capital for their operations. And it's riskier and riskier, and that's where a lot of this funding is going towards. So the risk has sort of pooled in that area. Another area is actually subprime auto loans. It's almost that in things like Dodd-Frank, they end up fighting the last war. So there were a lot of curbs on the type of mortgage activity in the originating mortgages that helped to create the last crisis, but they did not do a lot of curbs on the type of activity of subprime auto lending. So you see a spike in that area. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, actually is barred from regulating auto dealers. So, big surprise, subprime auto loans spike because that's the one area that is a little less regulated than the others. It's the same.
So who put that into the CFPB, by the way? How did that where did that come from?
Funny story. There's a guy named John Campbell he's retiring, I think, this year, but he's a Republican congressman, and he is an auto dealer. he owned a bunch of auto dealerships in Orange County, and he put this rider in, and then Democrats accepted it in Dodd-Frank to block auto dealers from regulation under the CFPB. Auto dealers are a pretty rich source of funding for political candidates. Pretty much every city has them. Every congressional district has auto dealers, which are pretty prominent members of the community in those congressional districts. And so they carry some force from a lobbying perspective. And so that's a little more unregulated, and so the money floods into that space. Same with these leveraged loans and collateralized loan obligations, which is basically, mortgages, subprime mortgages were sort of packaged into these bonds and then sold all over the world. And the idea was if you cut them up and slice and dice them enough, you could never fail with them. And then, of course, they did fail. Collateralized loan obligations are the same thing, only instead of cutting up mortgages, you're cutting up corporate debt. And so these very risky junk bonds are then getting pushed together into and packaged in securities, and the idea is exactly the same. Well, there are so many of these that even if some of these businesses fail, then the CLO, the collateralized loan obligation, will still survive. It's the same blinkered kind of logic that led us to the subprime meltdown, and because they never accounted for the fact that all of them could fail at the same time. So that's kind of what we're seeing in the CLO space. But the real point here is that the conditions are still there. Investment banks, the shadow banking system, hedge funds, these areas, they're still allowed to take on lots and lots of debt. And there's still the growing suspicion that if that debt fails, that people will, in the financial industry, will throw this on the government and ask for a bailout and receive one. And so until you break that cycle, the conditions are there for another crisis. And as long as we have generally the same system in place, and in fact, an even bigger system, because the biggest banks only got bigger since the crisis, you're going to have this cloud hanging over your head.